Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're taking a completely fascinating journey through time to figure out exactly how human housing transformed from, well, bare-bones survival all the way to the ultra-cozy modern comforts we completely take for granted today. I am so thrilled you're here because the history of where we live, it's really the history of who we are as a species. So let's kick things off with a pretty fundamental question. How in the world did we get from sleeping out under the open sky to kicking back in a modern home? It's a massive, massive leap. Right now, you likely have a safe, warm, quiet place to retreat to. But, it absolutely didn't start out that way. Thousands and thousands of years ago, there were literally no buildings at all. Zero. To really grasp this, we have to kind of put ourselves in the shoes of early humans. Imagine the wind constantly whipping your face, the freezing ground right beneath your bare feet. No walls, no roof to protect you from the wide open world. Early people were always on the move, chasing animals and foraging for food. They faced wild predators, freezing nights, and pouring rain with absolutely no shelter. Sure, they used nature, climbing up trees to make branch beds out of reach of predators, or hiding out in natural caves. But what happens when you're in a place with no caves? That brings us to Section 1, the first shelters, finding safety in a wild world. Well, when nature doesn't give you a cave, human ingenuity kicks in. You make your own shelter. Early people figured out a brilliantly simple method. First, they pushed tree branches deep into the ground in a wide circle. Then, they bent those branches and connected them at the top to form a sturdy frame. Finally, they covered the whole thing with whatever they could get their hands on: leaves, tall grass, or heavy animal skins. Now, were these huts perfect? Absolutely not. The wind shook them, and they definitely leaked. But they worked. They gave families a safe, dry spot to sleep. But what if you're stuck in the Ice Age, surrounded by endless snow, and there are literally no trees around to use for branches? This is where early humans blew my mind with their adaptability. They actually used the massive ribs and tusks of giant mammoths to build their shelter frames. They covered these bone structures completely in heavy animal skins and grass, and then kept the inside warm with a fire. Building a smart, life-saving house out of bones? It sounds wild to us today, but it was absolutely crucial. It kept them alive through those brutal winters.
Moving right along to Section 2, the farming revolution, planting roots and building to last.
So for millennia, humans were purely nomadic. They just roamed from place to place, leaving temporary huts behind. But then, about 10,000 years ago, everything flips. The invention of farming was a total game changer. Because people were planting crops like wheat and barley, they had to wait around for them to grow, which meant they couldn't keep moving. This massive shift directly led to the birth of the very first permanent villages. We went from chasing our food to growing it, and it changed the course of housing forever. To build these new, permanent homes, people turned to the dirt right beneath their feet. They mixed mud with straw and water to create these incredibly strong, sun-dried mud bricks. In the Middle East, a place called Jericho became home to some of the oldest permanent houses on the planet. And over in modern-day Turkey, at a settlement called Çatalhöyük, urban planning was just wild. They built their mud brick houses so incredibly close together that there weren't any streets. People literally walked across the rooftops and climbed down ladders through a hole in the roof to get inside. It's like a giant puzzle. And these homes weren't just for sleeping anymore. They became safe vaults for storing tools, seeds, and food. The house had officially become a home.
Which leads us to Section 3, the rise of cities, building upwards and adapting to climates.
As populations boom, families turn into communities, villages grow into towns, and suddenly you have the world's very first cities. Architecture had to adapt fast. In Mesopotamia, the city of Uruk started featuring these much larger mud brick houses that actually had multiple separate rooms and beautiful open courtyards. Meanwhile, over in ancient Egypt, builders had a completely different problem: blistering desert heat. So they engineered homes with exceptionally thick walls to trap the cool air inside and totally flat roofs. They perfectly adapted to their extreme environment. But as massive empires like ancient Rome grew, a really sharp social divide started showing up in how people lived. The wealthy folks, they were living in absolute luxury in these sprawling homes called adamas. We're talking large open centers, vibrant painted walls, gorgeous mosaic floors, and get this, indoor water channels flowing right through the house. But for the everyday, ordinary Roman citizen, they were packed into things called insula. These were 5 to 6 story high wooden and brick apartment buildings. They were notoriously cramped, frequently caught fire, and were just a world away from the luxury of the domus.
Now for Section 4, from castles to comfort, navigating danger and the return to beauty.
After Rome fell, Europe entered the Middle Ages. And let me tell you, things got pretty bleak. The world was dangerous, and your house was all about survival. The wealthy basically went into hiding. They built these massive, heavy stone castles up on high hills, surrounded by moats and towering walls. Now, they were incredibly safe, for sure, but they were also freezing cold and pitch black inside because the windows had to be tiny for defense. Everyday people, on the other hand, lived in tiny, one-room cottages made of wood, mud, and straw. No glass windows, no running water. In fact, to survive the freezing winters, families would bring their farm animals inside to share the space just for the extra body heat. It was rough, but people made it work.
Thank goodness, the world eventually started to brighten up again. We enter the Renaissance, literally meaning rebirth. This era was bursting with art, science, and totally fresh ideas. Architects started looking back at those gorgeous ancient ruins from Greece and Rome and realized, hey, our buildings don't just have to be dreary stone fortresses anymore. We can actually make them beautiful again.
For the first time in centuries, a house became a place to purely enjoy. We're talking massive upgrades here. Architects brought back large glass windows, flooding rooms with natural sunlight. They designed much higher ceilings, giving everything this wonderful, airy sense of spaciousness. Walls were covered in beautiful art, and these homes were surrounded by incredible, lush gardens and flowing fountains. It was a complete 180 from those dark, defensive castles.
But the real game changer? Boom, the Industrial Revolution. Machines completely transformed how we worked, and cities just exploded in size overnight. To handle this crazy housing crisis, builders started mass-producing homes. They built endless rows of identical terrace houses and stacked tall apartment buildings floor after floor. But here is the absolute best part, the upgrades. For the very first time in human history, ordinary homes were getting indoor running water, gas for heat, and eventually, electricity. Just think about that. For thousands of years, humanity survived without flipping a switch for light or turning a tap for water. These are incredibly recent, magical inventions.
And that brings us to Section 5, the modern home, the final frontier of comfort. Today, our ingenuity just keeps soaring. We've got incredibly diverse architecture solving all sorts of modern problems. We have tiny, energy-efficient homes designed to leave a smaller footprint, all the way up to high-tech smart homes. I mean, we literally have computers hidden inside our walls that can turn on the lights, draw the curtains, and lock the front door all by themselves. If you brought one of our mammoth bone-building ancestors into a smart home today, they would absolutely think you were a wizard.
To wrap up this explainer, I want to leave you with this really beautiful thought. A house is made of walls and a roof and a floor, but a home, a real home, is made of the people inside. It is made of warmth, of safety, of the feeling that you belong somewhere. When you look back at it, the evolution of houses is really just the evolution of us. We went from shivering under the open sky to stocking mud bricks to wiring electricity into the walls. The architecture has completely shape-shifted, but that fundamental, deep-rooted human need to feel safe and connected, that has not changed one bit since the very first cave fire. So I'll leave you with this. What kind of space truly makes you feel most at home? Thank you so much for exploring this incredible history with me today.